Welcome to CharityVillage Connects. Over the past few years, many people have raised concerns about the role of philanthropy in Canadian society and how it can evolve from its colonial roots to become a better force of good. With the recent changes to the disbursement quota and the regulation around funding non-qualified donees, the rise in community-centered fundraising, and the revelations around the chronic lack of funding to Indigenous, Black, and women's organizations and causes, many in the sector feel that philanthropy in Canada is ready for a shakeup. Joining us today to discuss these important issues is Liz Liske, a director of the Arctic Funders Collaborative. Liz is a Yellowknives Dene First Nation member. She joined the philanthropic sector after years working for her Indigenous government. In her role with the collaborative, she interacts with its members and supports their collective activities and the development and ongoing growth of the Arctic Indigenous Fund, or AIF. Welcome to CharityVillage Connects, Liz.
Thank you, Mary.
Well, maybe we could start by introducing to our audience what the Arctic Funders Collaborative is and the work that the organization is doing.
The Arctic Funders Collaborative, the most simplest way to describe it is they're an affinity group. We are comprised of funders, and these funders are members of the Arctic Funders Collaborative. They came together, I guess I could start off by about 15 years ago. They came together, funders. They had a common interest in grant making in the Arctic. However, there wasn't many grant makers in the Arctic, so they sort of band together and were leaning on each other on how best to do grant making in the Arctic. And then it grew from there. So now we have about 13, 14 members, and they've come together and they continue to collaborate. They continue to learn how to be better grant makers in the Arctic by forming relationships with people from the Arctic. Majority of the people that are from the Arctic are Indigenous people, so they're learning how to, distribute funds and work with the people, and they continue to do that learning, and I would even say unlearning today. Within the past few years, so since 2018, they actually created a project called the Arctic Indigenous Fund, and the project was for the fund to be self-determining fund, and that the fund would be Indigenous led, and they would have full authority over their grant making dollars. So the fund is run by a manager, my coworker, Shanae Kalthik-Velpe, and she has 8 advisors from across the Arctic. So we have 2 advisors from the Sapmi region, which is Norway and like Finland and Sweden. We have 2 advisors from Canada, 2 advisors from Greenland, and then 2 advisors from Alaska. Russia is part of the Arctic. There are Russian Indigenous people. However, in order to work with our Russian Indigenous friends, we are still trying to figure out how to do that in a safe way. So their fund, they have partners, and some of the partners are members of the Arctic Funders Collaborative. So basically, they've been doing grant making in their own way, and the Arctic Funders Collaborative, because it's their project, they've actually had, their own, it's been their own type of like learning tool. So that's, I guess, like the AFC in a nutshell.
Okay, so I guess you're assisting the funding organizations in being able to work with more directly with Indigenous communities in terms of having the Indigenous communities input into how the funding is granted. Am I understanding this correctly?
That's a part of it, yes.
Okay. And what unique challenges do you face as a funder working in the Arctic and with the Arctic communities beyond what I assume is, of course, issues around remoteness of many of these communities? What unique challenges do you face?
I would just correct you a little bit. The Arctic Funders Collaborative, we're not a fund. So we don't give out funding. I don't do any grant making. I would say uh, my place in the philanthropy sector is a little bit unique because I'm not necessarily a funder and I'm not necessarily somebody who requires funding because our group is based on membership. So that's how we are run and we organize. But I guess in a way that you know coming into this position, they intentionally and purposely hired an Indigenous person to lead that work. So I guess indirectly, yes, I do have some influence on funding and how that works. And to answer your question about challenges, I think the main challenges is probably that you have funders who come in who aren't from the community. Having that community knowledge and experience, like lived experience, I feel that is really important and something that is probably like the biggest challenge that they face.
So I guess I misspoke. I apologize. I understand that the role of the collaborative is to actually work with the funders or the foundations that are seeking to provide grants within the Arctic. So I'm getting that more correctly. Is that right?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. And so again, it comes to this whole issue of I suppose like a lot of the foundations are external to the Arctic and in terms of where they're based and their leadership. And so your role is critical in supporting the way in which they make better connections with the Indigenous communities in the Arctic so that their grant making is more effective in providing support. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, good. So I guess what causes the challenge of them? Is it the fact that they are not Indigenous led and that they've struggled with understanding how Indigenous communities can better be served?
I think it's more about, I think I just want to maybe talk a little bit about the definitions or like the words that I'm going to use. So we have, the way that I talk about philanthropy, I think it should be distinguished between Indigenous philanthropy and then settler philanthropy. I think I shouldn't say I think, I know settler philanthropy in the way in which that they're used to operating, especially within individual institutions. They're individual institutions. They are not regulated, so everybody operates in their own way.
I think you're identifying really something that we want to discuss for sure, and that is that I guess the colonial roots of some of the basis of philanthropy, including what you're referring to, I think of as settler funders or foundations, for example. are challenged in the work that they do with Indigenous groups in the Arctic, because they historically have not worked with the Indigenous groups, rather than and they've sort of come at it in a colonial fashion, or one where it has some of the roots of colonialism in terms of how they interact with the Indigenous communities. Is that correct?
Yeah, I actually thought of the word that I was thinking of. So it's more transactional for them. And the work that I'm trying to do is more about, I guess, the quality of the relationship, and then it being more transformative on their experience in the way in which that they choose to grant make.
Yeah, I guess trust-based giving is I guess a call for less control over the recipient of the grants, right? And that's what the whole regulations that used to prohibit um, charities from giving to non-qualified donees, or organizations that weren't charities. Now, of course, that legislation new legislation's been passed, and the CRA have done consultation, so it's not yet spelled out exactly how it's all going to work. But I guess the bigger picture of the question was really, I would think, from what I've gathered, what your role is, that you would think that certainly the changes have not gone far enough yet, that you want to see them continue to evolve. And I guess I would ask you, where would you like this to evolve in terms of the changes that you think should be made?
Yeah, that makes me think of like where we're at now. A lot of it's just like theory. Everybody has, I think their head is in the right place, but then actually practicing it is, I think, where the risks need to be taken. I was part of a conference, and there was a presentation talking about a lot of the projects and initiatives that funders are interested in. The like old thought and idea when it comes to like philanthropy was, there's always going to be that end goal. There's going to be like a deliverable, and that's sort of what how settler philanthropy mine, I guess, like works when it comes out. Like, I give you money, you give me a product, you give me a deliverable. What the presenter was trying to the point that they were trying to make to come across is like, if you're truly trying to have trust-based philanthropy and authentic relationships, especially if you're calling upon Indigenous people to help with the where your interest lies, especially when it comes to like climate change or revitalizing Indigenous languages. They're starting to see like all the connections and how important those initiatives are, that you're going to have to go in, and it's going to be risky. It's going to be risky in the sense that the way that the community needs to work is that it might not follow the year timeline that you have in your head, and that you're going to have to be okay with that. That like however long a project takes, you're going to have to trust that process. You might even have to trust that the deliverable that they said that they might make, that it might be different. So it's almost as if and I think essentially that's what trust-based philanthropy is you can get an idea of what the community wants to do, but at the end of, I think, your time and your relationship together, things might change over time. And I think that's another big piece about the giving part, is that it's also attached to relationship, and that transactional relationships are short. They're like, the best way that I can describe it is that it's a cold relationship. It's um um yeah. And if you're doing the opposite of those things, it's like you're having that continued dialogue. You know, you're getting to know the community, you're getting to know the people, and then um, you're building that trust. And I think the only way to build that trust is that relationship piece. And in the work that I do with the funders at the Arctic Funders Collaborative, is there has been three things that have been guiding my work lately, and one of them is deepening relationships in the Arctic, and that's part of that transformational work that the members are that we're doing together. Um, and you know, it's not something that um, we figured out or we've designed and we have all the answers. It's like something that's going to happen over time. And um, I think, just speaking from my own Indigenous perspective, is that is what Indigenous people sort of like need. Is, you know, we've come from um, our experiences, especially with settler people, like not just in philanthropy, but um, there has been a lot of distrust. There's, you know, we've been treated inhumanely. Um, One example is like research. Like, people come in, they do their research, they take everything back with them, and it's almost like they're just using the people. So there's a lot of like um, distrust in that way. So I think if we're putting the power back into Indigenous people's hands, and that's part of this work, um, is thinking about, you know, that history and understanding and learning about, you know, the people that you're working with and building that trust together. Um, so I think it's like it's a little bit complex and not as streamlined and um, pre-calculated, I guess, is how I would say, like I would describe the way that settler philanthropy currently works.
Yeah, I understand that, because if you see it from a transactional lens, then it is inherently, the relationship is, I guess, ends at the when the transaction is complete, is what you're saying, and that's not the best way to make meaningful change. And furthermore, it's one of the things that the Indigenous communities have resented of their experience in working with settler philanthropy and foundations. Is that correct?
Yes.
I'm curious about your views on, certainly we've seen some recent reports on the chronic lack of funding to, Black, Indigenous, and feminist charities and causes. But, certainly you have a particular lens that's unique. What needs to change in the philanthropic community to ensure that funding is more equitable in terms of its distribution to these groups?
I'm thinking of I guess like the data a lot. There's some work that's been published out there that where you could see those numbers. So the data shows, yes, like um, Indigenous and Black communities are underfunded. Um, Funders, it's almost like they live in their own little world, and unsolicited um, applicants aren't necessarily welcomed. So I guess like the power dynamic that needs to change. Um, and, you know, I think anybody could understand that, it's hard to give up control. Um, Especially if you have different worldviews and you don't know what the group will do with it. So, if we want to really think deep about it, um, I I understand that. I think from an Indigenous perspective, I've thought about this, and it's when we're given, like, let's say a community or an initiative or an Indigenous led group, we're just given a bunch of, or had the freedom maybe to work with money and it being unrestricted, and you were able to you had the chance to use it in a good way, and I guess from my perspective in the right way, aligning with our culture, our traditions, our language, our spirituality, our our history, our oral history, what our stories um, tell us, because that's ultimately what guides us in our time here. And because Indigenous people haven't been given those opportunities, or when they are given those opportunities, we're basically making up as we go along, and that's um, a little bit hard uh, to trust, I guess you could say. Um, but at the same time, um, like I said, we've we have our own way of doing things, and if we were able to have that opportunity to work on, important and maybe even like world changing initiatives, that um, it would be for the better. But you would need to be able to to give that, and have that have that power shift. Yeah, I think that question too just leads to, trusting our process. Um, I I would like lean. I would probably take back a little bit of like making it up as we go along, um, because we have like I said, our own worldview, our traditions, our culture, our spirituality, and our our languages that would help guide that work. It's almost that we would have to adapt it and evolve it to where we're at now. Um, and we've been doing that. We've been adapting since like contact. Um, just from my own history, my people have only been colonized for a little over 150 years. So it wasn't too long ago that we were living off the land.
Well, I think you're really kind of almost leading into my next question, which is, from your perspective, can we dig into what challenges exist in terms of creating that sort of trust-based relationship, that more long-term, non-transactional relationship between the funders and the Indigenous communities? I mean, how can we improve these relationships? I mean, what steps do we have to take?
I think just like letting, like if you're working with an Indigenous community, is if, to work with them in a more authentic way and not come in with your own preconceived ideas of or have expectations, really. um, I can speak to some of the changes that were in the different ways in which we're working at the Arctic Funders Collaborative. Our next annual meeting, we are going to be we chose to go to Kotzebue, Alaska. I've never been there. And previously, when they would do annual meetings, they would kind of just pick a place and go there. And most of these places, especially now with like reconciliation and land acknowledgements, all of these places, there's original peoples there. So if you're going to somebody's territory, the right and respectful thing to do is to announce yourself, introduce yourself, and provide information as to what your intentions are, and your willingness to let the community guide your work and have input, and real input. And that's what I mean by like not coming in with your own preconceived ideas. So what I'm doing, and this is the first time in my 2 years at the AFC, is I will actually be visiting Kotzebue before. I've made some connections with some of the local Indigenous people. I plan to meet the tribe there and introduce myself in our work and let them know our intentions and provide them with the date that we are hoping to go, but also putting in their hands alternative dates. If that date doesn't work for them, maybe they can help us choose a date. So we're really looking at developing a relationship with them and then also helping guide that work. And in addition to that, so that I think I have to say from my Indigenous perspective, I really struggle with trying to do this work, but then not exploit my own people, or feel like I'm being extractive. So in addition to that, we're hoping to either grant to them, give them a gift of money so that they can do whatever they want with it, and then also invite Indigenous guests so that they could have their own knowledge exchange and learn from each other. Indigenous people from around the world, we all have similarities and common struggles or even successes. And having that opportunity to learn from each other is very valuable. And that's one way that we're evolving and working a little bit differently.
Yeah, excuse me. That's a good example of how the collaborative is establishing new best practices for how it operates, and especially with Indigenous groups. I wonder if you have any particular success stories that you'd like to share with our audience of, even a process that you worked on, or a project that you worked on with a foundation or a funder that took some new innovations and was successful in actually achieving something that was new or kind of closer to the goals that you've talked about?
I think just in my time and the work that I've been doing at the AFC, I actually failed to mention that we have our own group of cultural advisors. I have 3 cultural advisors. I have an Indigenous man from Russia His name's Edward Zador. Lila Rasmus, who I like to say kind of represents the subarctic. She actually lives here in Yellowknife, and that's where my office is located. And then Abiaya Lang, who's from Greenland. So they also so increasing Indigenous representation in institutions is part of that change, and something different that I see. And then I guess like just the knowledge exchanges with Indigenous minds and like understanding Indigenous philanthropy. When I work with when we're bringing people in and trying to increase the representation of Indigenous people in philanthropy, Indigenous people come in and they're like, what's philanthropy? And I'm like, you know what philanthropy is? And I'm like, Indigenous people are the original philanthropists. Basically, it's giving. And we understand giving the way that we understand giving. And this is one of the examples that I like to give is a hunter. When a hunter goes out hunting for big game, especially like let's say caribou, it's just in my region that, I grew up on caribou, but when a hunter goes hunting, he hunts his caribou and he brings it home and he shares it with his family, shares it with the community. And that's common. That is our way of life. That is how we operate. And a hunter never goes out and comes back and like keeps that food for himself, that meat for himself. So when I explain philanthropy in that way, Indigenous people get it right away. And so yeah, just I think increasing the Indigenous representation, even Black representation, putting them in leadership roles, creating advisory roles is also, I think, really important. If you're truly looking to change your institutions from within, then you would have to, I would say if you're looking to increase your granting dollars to Indigenous people, I think the best way to do that is hire Indigenous people.
I really liked your example of Indigenous philanthropy as being about the hunter returning to his community and sharing it and not expecting anything back. And I think that is a strong comparison to what you're referring to as, I guess, settler philanthropy, which is that transactional bit that you've described. Am I understanding you correctly?
Yes.
I'd love to know about a recent quote that had you speaking on the importance of funders focusing on healing-centered engagement as opposed to trauma. Can you explain this a bit more and help me and our audience understand what you mean by that and why it's important?
Yeah, that's actually one of the 3 things that I talked about earlier that's been guiding my work. So I can go over them again. So it's like deepening relationships in the Arctic. The next one, and I really love this one, it's letting the land inform our work. A lot of the work, or a lot of the scope of work from like funders has a lot to do with like the environment, waters, supporting Indigenous land stewardship, and but they do all this from like a boardroom. So I'm just like, what are you guys doing? Like, you need to, like, if this is like really your passion or this is your scope of work, like you need to be out on the land. So that's that's really important to me. And then the healing center engagement, which is also could be described as being trauma informed. Um, I moved away from saying being trauma informed because that really limits the way that you could think about, um, I think, like Indigenous people. One of the things that I say about here in the North, especially in the NWT, is the NWT is made up of, we make up 50% of the population. Um, and then I say that, every Indigenous person is touched by trauma. That's our reality. Um, and But if you start talking about being trauma informed, that separates us. That separates that Indigenous people have trauma and that they need help, and that, um, and then, settler people are sort of, um, separate from that. However, if you approach it from a healing centered engagement, healing is for everybody. And, even in our history and our time together, everybody needs healing from that. And, that should be the center of your engagement. That should be, the focus. And that the focus shouldn't be on, I guess, I would say, on like a negative, um, subject or way of thinking about it. Um, you know, Being trauma informed is important and great because it's it's not really looking at the person from a lens of like, I have to save this person, but understanding that yes, I have trauma, but I'm more than my trauma. And, and that we're all on healing journeys and that we can do it together. So instead of creating terms and spaces and thinking on separating us, it's thinking of ways that how we could connect and work together and coexist.
So, as the leader of the collaborative, is that sort of the essence of how you would like a new approach to philanthropy look like, or be reimagined? Is that sort of the essence of how you see it could be better?
Definitely. I think, the three things that have been guiding my work lately could you could definitely, um, translate that into your own work and use that to do things differently, to, like, I guess, like, elevate your work. I I like the term reimagining on what philanthropy could look like, but also, um, you know, there are some things um, that are that could be useful, like, um, that we currently do. Some funds are also like, uh, do unrestricted funding, and I think that's great. Like, how could you elevate that? You know, so yeah.
I'd like to know from your perspective how philanthropy can better support the really important work of reconciliation in this country. What would you like to leave with our audience to think about on this point?
The word that's like I'm thinking of right now is just like respect. And an example that I think of is traveling. So when you're traveling to a different country, I kind of like to use China as an example. Everybody in China speaks Chinese, and when you're gonna visit that country, um, as like a tourist, you kind of have no choice but to try to learn their language, learn their culture, so that you're not breaking any laws, um, so that you communicate a little bit. Um, from my Indigenous perspective, you know, in Canada, um, like make the example a little bit smaller, you know, our settler friends and people don't go to those lengths to respect us. You know, are you learning our language? Are you learning our culture and our laws to make sure that you're not disrespecting us?
Well, Liz, it's been really fascinating speaking with you about your work and your views on philanthropy. Thank you for joining Charity Village Connects. Our audience of nonprofits, and foundations, and professionals that work in them will really appreciate your comments.